In the war between the human race and the coronavirus, an army of supercomputers battles back.
This is like one of the most amazing machines in the world.
Under the leadership of an unlikely general.
It's kind of like the race car of computers.
Today, we head inside one of the largest corporate laboratories on the planet for a rare sit-down interview with the man who staged a revolutionary fight against the pandemic.
It's capable of doing something like 200,000 trillion calculations per second.
Alongside fierce competitors.
The sense of urgency is something that transcended any institution.
And even the White House.
Was it you that made the first call to the White House?
I made a phone call to the White House.
And now the head of IBM Research is predicting the next pandemic might be a lot closer than we think.
You could imagine a virus that mutated much faster than this one does.
But there is a silver lining to that dark cloud. Hello, everyone. I'm Tara Rosenblum. Amid all the death, anguish, and uncertainty brought on by the pandemic, an historic technological breakthrough is also offering hope. We recently sat down with Dr. Dario for an exclusive interview at the IBM Watson Research Center in Yorktown Heights.
For the layperson, can you tell us what a supercomputer is capable of, the extent of its power, and some examples of how it impacts us in our everyday lives?
Well, I mean, we're all familiar with the power of computers. We use them in our everyday life. And as the name indicates, it's kind of like the race car of computers. It's machines that are designed to be able to perform calculations that really push the boundaries and the limits. So what they look like is they're actually giant machines, and there are racks and racks and racks of computers in a large data center. And when I'm talking large, these are machines, some of them that can cost hundreds of millions of dollars to build. And they're able to then perform scientific calculations that are simply impossible to do any other way.
So this is some extreme muscle power. Did your supercomputing research have a direct or indirect impact on the vaccines we're seeing coming out from Pfizer, Moderna, AstraZeneca?
Yeah, so what happens is for those vaccines, they were already, sort of in the pipeline of development on the core methods that were in the past, and then they had to be adapted to the specific coronavirus. So that adaptation and going through the clinical trials had to be early on, right? They had to start like phase 1 in April and so on. But it didn't have a causal connection to those vaccines because, that effort had to proceed in parallel to this basic understanding that we're doing right now.
So overall, looking at the big picture, right, believe it or not, we're 8 months into this pandemic. What are the concrete examples of progress that you feel are the most eye-opening?
Well, I think we always have to look back and step it in context of, for example, from a vaccine development, as we all know, the fastest thing that had ever been developed was in the context of 4 years. Sometimes, there are many other diseases that we've never developed a vaccine for, even after decades of work. So the very fact that we've had the most unprecedented global R&D race to be able to compress the time is something that we also need to step back and celebrate, that we can come together as scientists across institutions to really unite and join forces to compress this time. Every day that the scientists are able to do that is a day we all get back. So I think one of the most interesting lessons for me in this whole journey is what is it going to change on how scientists collaborate with one another beyond this specific pandemic. And one realization I've been reflecting on is that after every major crisis in society, we've seen institutions change. So for example, after World War II, we had mobilized the scientific and technological capacity of the nation to win the war. I mean, we all know about Los Alamos and, and the efforts that took place there, the development of radar, etc. At the end of the war, there was also a lot of thinking about what do we do with all this scientific and technological capacity. And there was a very wise move to mobilize them in the context of peace and prosperity. That led to the creation of the National Science Foundation, the national laboratories of the United States. Later in the Cold War, when we saw Sputnik, the response of the United States created DARPA, a new agency to do that. So a question is, what are we going to create now in response to this global pandemic?
I want to go back to what you said a moment ago, which is you referred to the speed in which these vaccines have been developed, which is pretty much unprecedented. However, to get FDA approval, they only need to show that their vaccine did not have any immediate or short-term health consequences. So how can we know that there are no long-term impacts from taking these vaccines?
Yeah, so that is like, the process of discovering the efficacy of these vaccines over time across all populations is why the clinical trials go in progressive larger and larger phases. So as we continue to roll it, we will continue to learn. That is a scientific method. Like the scientific method is not based on the principle that you achieve like one experiment and you know it all. You create standards of security and safety, and what we know in the FDA is we have the highest safety standards in the world in doing that. And there's a history of precedent that when we meet certain standards, we deem things safe. But if you ask scientists, we hate to have categoricals of everything is perfect, this is the end, and we know it all. So what's going to happen, for example, in the relationship when talking about supercomputers, one of the things we will apply them for is as we deploy treatments and vaccines broadly, and there are different types of vaccines within the population, we're going to have to continue to study and analyze the impact of these treatments and vaccines on different populations, of different conditions. And through that understanding, it would allow us to refine and say the right, sometimes the right dosage, what is the right vaccine, the right treatment, depending on that. So we're going to continue to learn, even though I have high confidence that we have a method to make them safe from day one, but it's not always like that's the end of the story. We got to continue to study and learn.
And I know scientists shy away from broad brush terms, like you mentioned, using the word perfection, but both Moderna and Pfizer are touting more than a 94.5 efficacy rate. How confident are you that we'll still see rates in the mid-90s once testing expands?
Well, I don't have any way to predict based on anything. I can only be guided by what has been shared publicly already. But I think the fact that we're seeing now at that rate is really good news, right? It's really encouraging news. Remember that the standard on this is about 50% efficacy would have been deemed as something that is a vaccine worth pursuing. The fact that they are in the 95% is extraordinarily good news, and I think we should be all happy about that.
So the next phase will be distribution, and we already know of at least one challenge that's relatively daunting, right? Pfizer's vaccine needs to stay extremely cold in a setting that's minus 70 degrees Celsius, while Moderna's requires negative 20 refrigeration, so about the temperature of a freezer. So the cold chain distribution network will be key as you try to get vaccines around the world in different climates and less developed countries. How will AI and supercomputing help the cold chain?
So if we look at what is the power of, again, some of these machines is to accelerate the rate of discovery. So one of the major threats that is really, really important is something called thermostabilization, which is the idea of can I have a stable compound, a stable vaccine at higher temperatures? So that is, a task in its own right that is a very, very important scientific endeavor, because what will matter, of course, is it will alter, as you correctly alluded to, the distribution channel. If you look at around the world and you look at places where electricity, right, is not present or it's hard to maintain cold environments, that will have very, very broad implications for the inequity around the distribution of vaccines. So we have to sort of tackle that problem simultaneously of ways to be able to get vaccines around the world, and simultaneously advances in different ways to stabilize these kinds of molecules and compounds so that they can survive at higher temperatures, which will make life easier.
And when you talk about inequity, I just got my hands on some data that showed the mortality rates from COVID-19 disproportionately affected the African American community here in New York and communities of color. Did your research and your data show any indication of why that's the case?
Not specifically in the work that was done in the High Performance Computing Consortium, although there is a significant amount of work and studies around this aspect of segmentation by population so that we are able to understand for treatments and vaccines what may be the best suited approach so that we can have a better response depending on that. I think the inequity that you're alluding to is, of course, deeply connected to the, systemic socioeconomic inequities that are present in society, right, around hospital treatments and levels of poverty and many other domains that actually impact this disease and many others.
Did any of the data that you've seen so far help you understand why some people seem to get more sick from the virus than others do?
I think the techniques and the approaches that are being analyzed are precisely the right ones that would allow them, the experts, in the context of what they're studying, to be able to do that.
These vaccines, they're so different than the ones we've seen in the past, not working with a live or dead virus, the messenger RNA vaccines. Do we know how long, if we take the vaccine, we're going to have immunity to the virus?
From the design of these vaccines so far, it seems like 1 or 2 doses for a period that would last, a year or multiple years seems like the design criteria that they are after.
Up next, the unheard story of a single phone call that sparked a technological breakthrough. We'll be right back. You're watching News 12. I'm Tara Rosenblum, and we continue now our exclusive sit-down interview with the head of IBM Research, Dr. Dario Gil.
In the earliest days of this pandemic, you helped to do something extraordinary. You helped to create what amounts to the largest public-private computing consortium in the history of the planet. So can you tell me more about how the COVID-19 high-performance computing consortium came to be, and was it you that made the first call to the White House?
Since we had access to some supercomputers ourselves that we have inside IBM, and we have designed and built for the Department of Energy of the United States some of the largest supercomputers in the world, we early on decided, hey, let's reach out to our colleagues in the national labs and see, instead of us saying alone, IBM, making access to supercomputers, what if we collaborated and a few of us worked together to give it to other scientists? And that immediately, once we got a quick response, this was in early March, once we got a quick response that they were enthusiastic, that's when I made a phone call to the White House, in that case to Michael Kratsios, who is the Chief Technology Officer of the United States. And I talked to him and I said, look, we're thinking of doing this and getting this started, but I think this is an idea that we should do nationally and involve different agencies and different companies. And there was like an immediately enthusiastic response. This was the second week of March. And from that phone call until it was launched, we just did it in 5 days. And we brought together competitors, of IBM, but like basically private sector, Microsoft joined, and Amazon and Google and many other ones. We brought together 7 national laboratories of the United States, NASA, the National Science Foundation, over a dozen universities. And within 5 days, no contracts, nothing, we launched it.
And that's what really fascinates me about this whole process, is that literally overnight you took some of the world's biggest tech competitors, NVIDIA, Intel, and they woke up the next morning on the same team. So, with you at the helm, what was it like to guide the transition from a competitive business mindset to a service-first mentality?
The reality of it is that we were all, the sense of urgency is something that transcended any institution. All of us were sharing it. All of us were personally affected, or institutions were affected. And I think in moments like that, it also speaks to the desire of all people to help. No one talked about, competition or credit or how to do it. Is what can each of us bring to the table? How do we coordinate? And how do we make this happen?
Once the pandemic is long gone, do you feel like the spirit of unity will continue for other global problems?
Well, I think that that's a challenge, honestly, because urgency and an emergency binds people together. But once you go back to normal, it is natural that new sets of behaviors will kick in and some other kinds of behaviors will disappear. So I do think that that's a really good question. It's very, very important, in my opinion, that we don't forget what aspects of this work, what have we learned in how we can collaborate with one another and apply it to other urgent problems that the world has and our nation.
Such as?
Well, climate change is another example, right? But we are also going to confront weather emergencies too, right? And hurricanes and other events where some of these tools can make a big difference. We are going to confront in the future other pandemics. This will not be the last one. And as horrible as this has been, you could imagine a virus that mutated much faster than this one does, higher levels of density, combined with a very interconnected world with air travel where you can very quickly move people from one location to another. Those are sort of like foundational elements that are likely to increase the frequency with which those migrations of virus from animal host to a human host can occur. So we as a society have to greatly increase our ability to monitor and respond with all these tools. So, for example, what's happening right now with the new vaccine approaches based on RNA and genetic information is really powerful. That's a great instrument to have. Genomic sequencing or sensing ability or ability to collaborate. We need to spend much, much more money on that aspect of insurance and prevention. Look how catastrophic the cost is right now. Wouldn't we be much happier how we spend $100 billion annually to prepare compared to the trillions of dollars of annual cost that these causes?
So it sounds like you feel like public-private partnerships and cooperation on a global scale is really a matter of life and death as we move forward here. You had such unprecedented cooperation, right, from literally all over the world for this consortium, with one glaring exception. China did not join this consortium. Were you surprised by that?
It was the model of the consortium is a model that was based on established relationships and trust. So when there's very high amount of interaction of institutions, it's a natural way without contract, with trust for intellectual property and trust on those models. That's how that happened. I think the fact, the challenges of having that sort of level of trust between institutions is reflective on the part that, that they were separate.
But you yourself personally probably have more access to data than anyone else literally on planet Earth. Make a prediction for me. Where do you think we're going to be in 6 months? Are we still in masks? Are we still socially distancing, waiting for vaccines?
Yeah, well, I'm not going to surprise you on that. Science engineers loath to do that. So here's what I know, the good news about it. So we have, over 30 vaccines that are on phase 3 clinical trials. We have the results from the first 2, right, that are in the most advanced stages with 95% efficacy rates. There will be more vaccines that prove effective. Now we're in a different challenge, and the challenge is scaling, distribution, and giving confidence based on sound scientific data and evidence to the public that these are safe. In accomplishing that goal, we will see a dramatic change, right, as the population, increasing percentage of the population receives the vaccine, of what our daily lives will look like. Combined with some of the many techniques that we're going to have to use while the percentage of people who are vaccinated increases. And that's going to be, wearing masks and social distancing and all the precautions that we're now driving. But I do think that 2021 is going to be markedly different than 2020. So it is great to be able to see now some hope, and hope based on actual science, and that there is a path forward. And I think so. So I think it will be markedly different, obviously, 2021.
Will you and your family be taking the vaccine when it's first available?
Yeah, I personally, now we're gonna, I think, through the data that is being shared, and there's gonna be a lot more evidence. I think there's a very important obligation from all the scientists who participated on that and FDA to be able to share that information with all of us. We all have then, or physicians, right, who are there, who are also professionals who will understand that data that is being presented. And I think through that process, I've taken all my vaccines, through my life, and my children as well, and so on. And vaccines work. But that has to be done in that context of evidence, your local physician, and then being able to engage. But I certainly am looking forward to the day I can take the vaccine, right, and recover part of my life.
Up next, the role of supercomputers as a crystal ball for the pandemic. Stay with us. We'll be right back. You're watching News 12. I'm Tara Rosenblum. We finish our conversation now with the head of IBM Research with a question about the role supercomputers can play in predicting the future behavior of the pandemic.
We know about Johns Hopkins COVID dashboard. It's a great snapshot of where the worst hotspots are in the world. How can we use that kind of data to determine where future hotspots might crop up? So, for example, if I want to look 6 months down the road into this pandemic, can supercomputing help me predict whether the United States would be faring better or worse, and even drilling down further, looking at something as hyperlocal as our home turf here in Westchester County.
Well, one of the things in that area of modeling, of trying to anticipate or create scenarios for the future, one very interesting area that is a very hot area in the world of AI is something called causal modeling, which is how do you attribute causality, the cause of something. So for example, in the context of the pandemic, it is being applied to decisions that, for example, local health officials or at the state level or national level we make in terms of social distancing or the requirements of masks or limited mobilities of travel as an example. And you try to say those decisions, how do they connect to future incidence rates?
And for Dario Gil, it's not just about the data. The fight against the pandemic is extremely personal. His native Spain was one of the worst global hotspots at the beginning of the pandemic, and a close relative in Spain became sick with COVID-19 and ultimately recovered. He's asking all scientists to step into an era of accelerated discovery to help all of humanity. For News 12, I'm Tara Rosenblum.